There's basically been a political and cultural revolution in the country really since the 1980s. We've essentially got a new elite graduate class that tends to live in the big cities and university towns, which tends to lean left on migration, gender.
Is it transphobic to say only women have a cervix?
It is something that shouldn't be said.
Cancel culture, political correctness, our history, our identity.
Are you praying? I might be praying in my head. You're under arrest.
Who we are as a people, as a country. Within the new elite, there are these radical progressives, about 15% of Britain, who don't just dislike the country, but I think they actively have a deep hatred, actually, of their national identity. It's a source of shame and embarrassment for them. And they're obsessed with the idea that Britain is institutionally racist, plagued by what happened centuries ago. That cultural terrain, that these divides between the new elite and the rest of the country have become very sharp.
You're not a feminist, so sorry.
My argument, at least, is they're not just here now, but they're going to be with us for years and decades to come.
For the wrong to rule, the good must just stand idly by.
Hello, hello. Now, who runs Britain? A rarefied class of men in grey suits sitting in gentlemen's clubs smoking pipes, or a new 21st century gentry sipping lattes and reading The Guardian in cafes in Islington, Oxford and Bristol? Matt Goodwin, one of the most thought-provoking and interesting academics working in Britain today, seeks to bring to light this question in his new book, Values, Voice and Virtue, The New British Politics. Matt argues that an increasingly liberalised and globalised ruling class has lost touch with millions of ordinary voters who found their values ignored, their voices unheard and their virtue denied. And I'm very privileged to speak with him today. Hi Matt, how are you doing?
I'm good, thanks for having me on. I've been looking forward to it.
My pleasure. I think I've got to start with the simple question. Who runs Britain?
Well, what I'm arguing in this book is that we've essentially got a new elite graduate class that tends to live in the big cities and the university towns, which tends to lean left on cultural and identity questions, and which over the last 10 years or so has been really becoming even more socially liberal, more radically progressive, embracing sort of woke ideology and so on, partly in response to things like Brexit, Donald Trump, and those political rebellions of the last decade. And if you look at our media class, creative industries, cultural institutions, universities, House of Commons, you can really see this new elite grouping extending its influence. And it's visible, Laurence, both in the Conservative Party and the Labour Party. I'm not just, taking a pop at the left with this book. What I'm saying is in many institutions now, you can see that they're disproportionately dominated by this group, and I think that's a real problem, which is why I wrote this book.
And they also disproportionately unrepresentative of what your average punter thinks. So why are they going down this path of hyperliberalism against the views of essentially the electorate?
Yeah, so basically I argue that there's basically been a political and cultural revolution in the country really since the 1980s, and that was really defined by three things. First was the embrace of hyperglobalization, putting the interests of big business ahead of the wider national community. The second was mass immigration, basically rebuilding Britain's political economy around importing cheap migrant labour. Again, that served the interests of business, and it chimed really nicely with the values of the new elite, who are much more socially liberal and cosmopolitan. And thirdly, it involved hollowing out Britain's national democracy, essentially pushing decisions away from ordinary voters so that they couldn't really exert any meaningful influence over the decisions that were affecting their daily lives. And really, this revolution lost touch with specific groups in Britain. It lost touch with lots of working class voters, lots of people who might not have passed through the elite institutions, and also older voters, and many of those who live outside of the big cities and the university towns. And this has become especially problematic, Laurence, because, as you know, politics has shifted now. We're not just talking about economics. We're not just talking about public services. We're talking about migration, gender, cancel culture, political correctness, our history, our identity, who we are as a people, as a country. And it's on that cultural terrain that these divides between the new elite and the rest of the country have become very sharp. And my argument, at least, is they're not just here now, but they're going to be with us for years and decades to come.
And it's almost sort of slightly terrifying if you look at some of the cultural issues that we're facing as a country. We've inherited this incredible cultural heritage, and it seems to be that this elite class and those heads of universities and heads of galleries and various are trying to decolonize it is their word, but actually it's taking our rich cultural heritage and destroying it and dragging everything down in a sort of slightly what one would associate with cultural Marxism, I suppose. Is there? You're saying this is going to get worse? It's not. We're not at a turning point yet.
Well, the first thing to say is this has been a long time coming. So really, my book is drawing on, earlier writing by people like Daniel Bell, who talked in the 1970s about the rise of what he called the new adversary culture, which is basically the rise of a new professional managerial elite, very different from the old elite. The old elite were sort of, coming from the aristocracy, inherited titles, wealth, but crucially, on cultural issues, the old elite often leaned to the right. They were often quite culturally conservative. They believed in the institutions, they believed in the nation. They had a very different outlook from this new left-leaning elite. But if you look at generally how things have been evolving since the 1970s, this group has not just become skeptical of the things that have traditionally held us together, like our shared identity and our culture. But they've also, I would argue, begun to repudiate that inheritance. They've begun to basically try and derive status for themselves and among their elite group by repudiating our shared history and identity and culture. Sir Roger Scruton, the conservative philosopher, once referred to this as the rise of oikophobia, the rise of a sort of hatred of where you come from, a denial of your home. Daniel Bell, Christopher Lasch, Michael Lind, many other academics over the years and thinkers have pointed to this group, and they've said, look, actually, one of the hallmarks of the new elite is that they simply feel much less attached to our national community and our home than other groups. And in this book, I'm perhaps taking that a bit further in saying that within the new elite, there are these radical progressives, about 15% of Britain, who don't just dislike the country, but I think they actively have a deep hatred, actually, of their national identity. It's a source of shame and embarrassment for them. And they're obsessed with the idea that Britain is institutionally racist, plagued by what happened centuries ago. So I think we are in a new moment, actually, today, Laurence. And I think this moment is going to be with us for a long while to come.
It's very interesting that that it's happening in the West rather than we're not, for example, these elite thinking people don't turn around and say we need to diversify Indian music or Chinese opera. They don't. So what, is it? Are we witnessing the sort of the beginning of the end of the West? This hatred is it going to infect people and is there any hope? Are we going to have to start again?
Well, I think there's definitely a sort of imbalance or an asymmetry in how the new elite view things like civilization and identity. I'll give you one example that I think is going to become particularly prominent over the next few years. If you think about how most people view Britishness or Englishness, I think many people out there outside of London and so on tend to think there is something distinctive, there is something unique, there is something special about being British or being English, being from these islands. What you tend to find with the new elite is that they would like to rewire or reshape that identity, that national identity, around a universal celebration of diversity and multiculturalism. So they want to basically repackage who we are along the lines of a much more international, global identity. My colleague Eric Kaufman refers to this as asymmetrical multiculturalism, that basically you're allowed to celebrate the distinctive identity and culture of minority groups, or indeed groups outside of the country. But when it comes to the majority British group, they're either told not to celebrate their distinctive identity or they're urged to reshape it around international themes like diversity. But as Francis Fukuyama, the academic, has recently said, to say that a country is welcoming is fine, and many countries are, but to say that that's the entire basis of your identity is like saying you don't really have an identity of your own. And I think that's what many voters are picking up on today. They think that actually this distinctive inheritance, this cultural inheritance, this political inheritance, this historical inheritance is being undermined and diluted by an elite group that basically wants to repackage that along these more global lines. And I think many voters are rebelling against that.
We'll get on to voters in a minute, but would you say that is Rishi Sunak an example of this? You know, he's essentially an unelected leader, and as you say, he pushes a very similar agenda to Keir Starmer's.
Well, I certainly think we've got the rise of a new consensus in British politics that, again, is adrift with what many voters out there are wanting. You know, the aftermath of Brexit, you can see we've really got a sort of big state, high immigration, pro-globalization, I would argue still pro-London consensus that many voters thought they were getting rid of by voting for Brexit. I mean, the only thing essentially that has changed really is that formally we've left the European Union, but actually for many voters, they're going to be looking at the overall levels of migration into Britain, the lack of a serious levelling up strategy, the way in which the national conversation is still dominated by the same groups with the same sets of values. And that's partly why, Laurence, as you know, I think we're beginning to see the fragmentation of many of those legacy institutions. We're beginning to see the rise of new media, new social movements, new political parties, and so on, who are trying, I think, to tap into this sense among many voters that the response to 2016, the response to the events of the 2010s has been woeful. I mean, you know, the elite class have not responded well to it. They've not given voice to lots of voters. They've not recognized or respected their values. If you basically challenge the economically and socially liberal consensus, you're quickly considered to be a pariah or to be seen as problematic for various reasons. And I just don't think we've opened up the national conversation in a way that the last decade was really all about. So that again is why I suspect, you know, it's not just Britain, by the way, but if you look at France, you look at Italy, you look at Sweden, you look at America, you look at Spain, Portugal. If you look at global politics now, you know, the rebellions that were really gathering pace over the last decade, and which I wrote about in my last book, those have just gathered steam. I mean, they've not gone anywhere. If anything, they've just become more prominent. The question is, what form will they take, and who will end up leading them when it comes to British politics?
And so try and answer the question for me. I mean, obviously, I look at you're very famous for polling, and I keep my eyes on the polls. And it seems to me that there's a lot of little parties fighting for no seats. So you know, even with a reform of probably the most well organised at the moment in that way. But I mean, is a traditional approach to politics, standing in 650 seats, getting, you know, desperately trying to get a seat in Parliament, more powerful than being, I don't know, possibly a political influencer, someone who is like I'm sort of a battering ram. I just batter my way through life, saying what a lot of people think, and then I get the treatment I deserve for it. But what would if you were put in charge of running the Reclaim Party moving into the next general election? What would you suggest we do?
Well, I think one of the realities of the British political system is that it has extremely high barriers to entry for new parties. And, you know, the classic example of that was UKIP in 2015 winning nearly 13% of the national vote, which was a very impressive level of support, but coming away with just one seat. So that problem has also become bigger since Brexit, because one of the ironies of Brexit is it removed the European Parliament elections, which were held under a form of proportional representation. So you've really only got two options as a new party today. One is to do the Lib Dem strategy of investing locally and building up grassroots support over a long period of time. And it took the Liberal Democrats a long period of time to do that. And even now they're limited to particular parts of the country. The second alternative is to do a sort of very narrowly focused, intensive campaign that, like we saw in 2015 and 2017 with the UK Independence Party, which is choosing a very small number of seats that are demographically very favourable to that particular party. And you saw that in areas like Clacton, Boston and Skegness, Thurrock, where you did see an overwhelming concentration of resource. That essentially is the Green Party model, right? Which is focus on Brighton and Bristol, the university towns, and don't spread yourself too thin. But as you say rightly, I think we're also now in a place where there is an intellectual battle going on. There is an intellectual battle over the future of conservatism. There's a battle going on over the future of liberalism. And I would argue there's a battle going on over the future of the institutions, over the extent to which they can actually continue to take the rest of the country with them, and that is leading to all kinds of new things, from a much more dare I say, diverse media system. YouTube, Substack, social media. But it's also, I think, leading to the rise of a whole generation of new thinkers who are in different ways challenging the established consensus. Think about the rise of gender critical feminists over the last 5 years. Think about the rise of critics of cancel culture and woke ideology. Think about the rise of the Brexiteers and Eurosceptics. Compared to 10 years ago, the intellectual terrain is radically different. And I think probably that raises the question of coherency. Is it maybe time for people to consider some form of broader umbrella or tent that can actually give that movement, that sort of pushback, whatever you want to call it, a greater sense of coherency and unity. And I think that's, in some ways, I'm more optimistic than I was a few years ago, because I can see so many people contributing to this very different and exciting ecosystem. But on the other hand, I sometimes wonder if maybe you can always have too many cooks in the kitchen, right? And maybe actually, giving this thing a sense of coherency, stability, and focus is probably the next key task.
And so, if it was to, obviously with Brexit, it was quite a simple thing. It was, do you want to be in the European Union, or do you want your own sovereignty? And that was a rich seam that you could mine there. But as you said, this is a very, very diverse, for want of a better word, situation. And if it had to be pinned to something, because to me it's definitely cultural. There is, obviously economics comes out of culture, all the migration, everything comes out of culture. It's a cultural movement. But if it needed to be pinned on one thing, if it needed a Brexit, what would that be for you?
Yeah, so I think it's a really interesting question. Brexit was Brexit. Brexit was also migration, of course. There were sort of two issues that came, well, there were three issues that came together in a remarkable way. There was a sort of anti-Westminster feeling, there was an anti-EU feeling, and there was an anti-immigration feeling, and they all sort of found they all flowed into that Brexit vote. I think today, I've just done a piece of work actually asking 2019 Conservatives to name the three issues on which they both feel very concerned about, but also not represented within the established politics. And descending rank order, number one is political correctness, or what we might call woke ideology, but in Britain, far more people still refer to political correctness than woke. But it's this sense that you can't really say what you want to say anymore, that there's a stifling culture descending across the country. The second was immigration, that today over half the country still think immigration is too high, that change is too quick, and that nobody is controlling the borders and demographic change. And the third was a desire to protect and promote Britain's distinctive identity, history, and culture, which many voters clearly feel is either being undermined or is being repackaged as something that is inherently negative. And we can see that in the debates over empire and slavery and statues and so forth. So I think, in my mind, if you go back to the 1980s and you look at the Thatcherites, they were chiefly focused on economic freedom. It was about unleashing the economy from the state and from communism and from regulation. I think today the kind of focus point is cultural freedom, is trying to allow the country's distinctive culture, traditions, ways of life to be protected, preserved, and promoted against these different forces that many people feel are bearing down on it. Political correctness, mass migration, the interests of corporates who don't really put the national community ahead of the search for profit and cheap labor. And I think that also taps into, by the way, the growing debate over what's happening in schools, and the way in which I think many people are increasingly nervous about how we're exposing children to political belief systems which, often have no basis in science and are clearly political projects. And I don't want to see Britain become America. I don't want to see Britain become as polarized as America. But unless we can get ahead of some of these debates and start pointing to why we need to reform the institutions and why we need to push back against what is quite a dogmatic ideology, then I'm worried that we will end up replicating what's happening across the Atlantic. And if you look at the schools issue there, well, that's a top three issue now, particularly for Republicans. And it's had an enormous impact on elections from Virginia to San Francisco. So again, it taps into this notion that our tradition of cultural freedom, our tradition of liberty in this country, which goes back a very long way, is now actually being attacked and undermined by this new school of thought. And that, I think, is probably what it all comes down to.
And as you said, it's been a very long march through all of our institutions. Are we going to have to march back through them? Is it going to take the same amount of time to return, to reclaim them all?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's happened essentially is that, as I write about in the book, there's sort of what we're living through is what academics often call education-based polarization, which is a complicated way of saying graduates are moving one way, non-graduates are moving the other. There are always outliers. There's always an Oxford professor who's conservative. There's always a Cambridge Don who doesn't like the woke. But I'm talking in sort of general sweeping terms here in terms of what's going on. And I think what's happened over time is that as the institutions have become more dependent upon the graduate class, especially elite graduates, as they've moved left as part of this so-called Great Awakening that has been tracked in America by people like Zach Goldberg, they're taking the institutions with them. So if you are in an organization like the BBC and the vast majority of your senior officers and directors are coming from the elite graduate class, their parents belong to the managerial professional class, they're financially secure, they're culturally radical. Well, over time, incrementally, those institutions are going to get pushed in that direction. Look at I always say every morning, my touchstone of where the debate is the BBC homepage. The first thing I look at, because that is a window into how the sort of, new elite see the country, see the debate, see the, rank what's important, what isn't. And I think over time, that in itself has become a really nice demonstration of what I'm talking about. So what do we need to do? We need to ensure, firstly, that there's a wider range of voices in the institutions, in the universities, in the media, in the creative industries, in the cultural institutions, and in politics. We need to ensure that people who come from different backgrounds, who are not always part of the new elite, who hold very different values, have their voice represented within the political system. And, what I've been doing over the last few weeks is trying to call out just how closed our conversation has become and how narrow it's become. And I've been quite surprised at the negative backlash and the reaction to simply pointing to that, because the new elite essentially want to maintain and entrench and expand their dominance within the institution. So it's not going to be an easy thing to reform, but it is entirely possible to do. And I think, secondly, we probably over the longer term need to start looking at things like how we select candidates and how we select the people who represent us within Westminster and politics. I mean, the most interesting debate in British politics right now is how to redefine and reinvent conservatism, right? Because it's clear to everybody that brand of politics has gone into a cul-de-sac. But then that raises the interesting question of, well, how do you replace the dominant faction within the Conservatives? Like, how would you replace liberal conservatives, Thatcherite conservatives, what you might call sort of economically, socially liberal, progressive Tories from the South? How might you actually reform a political party from within? And I think if you look at America, if you look at France, you look at Italy, lots of centre-right parties have been reformed and reshaped from within. And that too, I think, is another important question, because unless people feel like they're in this political debate and they've got a representative in this political debate, then they are just simply going to walk away from politics. And the winner in all of this will be apathy. It won't necessarily be a surge of populism at the next election. It might just be millions of people sitting at home, and we might wake up the morning after the next general election and realize that neither Rishi Sunak nor Keir Starmer are capable of mobilizing a large chunk of the country. So there are lots of things we can do, but for me, I think it really comes down to increasing the range of voices and values in the institutions.
I couldn't agree more. What's so difficult though about it, and it is that, you know, people go into politics and they've always got one eye on what they're going to do once they're an ex-MP, and then they're going to go into these corporations and institutions which are thoroughly woke. So therefore, they need to signal their right on this from their elected position. So it's going to be very, very difficult. I mean, obviously, Richard Tyson, Ben Habib, and that lot say the only thing to do is destroy the Conservative Party, but I say no, that's not the right thing to do. The right thing to do is get the Conservative Party to be conservative. And yeah, then you would need to have the conversation about what conservatism is. But I think we've sort of drilled down into, for me, it all has to come out of the right to express yourself freely. And if you can't express yourself freely, then nothing's going to change anyway. And with confidence. So I suppose, you know, in all of our little ways, that's what we do. You're writing about it. You're essentially going, guys, there's a problem. And this is the problem. Other people are like me. I'm a sort of cultural battering ram, and then you've got the more formal ones. But it's not. I was expecting it to be a more depressing conversation, that we're all screwed, but we're not. So thank you for taking the time to speak to me, Matt. And
absolutely delighted to.
And go out and read the book. It's been lovely speaking, and I will see you soon.